Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call to order this Intergovernmental Relations Committee on May 23rd. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm the chair of the committee, and I'm joined today by a quorum of our committee members, council members Warsame, Schrader, and Jenkins. And before us today, we've got 6 items on our agenda, and 4 of which are consent items. I'll go through the consent items first. We've got an amendment to our legislative agenda and policy positions. We've got a resolution supporting working people in collective bargaining. We've got number 3 is authorizing the city to join an amicus brief in support of the separation statute in U.S. versus California. And item number 4 is a passage of a resolution urging the federal government to continue to work on building a relationship between the United States and Cuba. I will see if any of my colleagues on this committee have any questions or comments on these items, and we'll note that we've been joined by Councilmember Reich as well. Questions, comments? Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I just wanted to comment on item number 4 on the consent agenda. I do understand that this is a international issue, but I think that here in the city of Minneapolis, we really have some pretty strong connections to the country of Cuba and a lot of Cuban nationals in our community. And so the passage of this resolution would send a strong signal for our support for the Cuban community here in Minnesota and throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments on these 4 items that have been moved? Not seeing any. All in approval, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, the motion carries. Moving on to item number 5. We have this listed as discussion. I know it's been through our Ways and Means committee, but it's related to the proposed amendments to the city charter relating to our increasing the limits on borrowing for capital expenditures and to allow for the combination of charter and state borrowing authority and transmitting the amendments to the Charter Commission. So do we have any comments or questions from committee members on this? Councilmember Warsame.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. This is like the first step in many steps to make this charter amendment, and we had a full presentation at Ways and Means, which Council Vice President Jenkins is also on, and I also made comments at the full council meeting. So thank you, and thank you for bringing this up, and thanks for your support on this as well, your leadership.
Thank you. And if anybody's curious for more information, please check out that very detailed presentation. I know we have on YouTube those videos from Ways and Means and on the city website as well. And also the documents posted out in our legislative information management system. So there's plenty of information out there and a lot of discussion on this. Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I think it might just be important if we just recap the process once again that Councilmember Warsame spoke to. I see Mr. Ruff in the audience, and if we can just get a brief recap. I mean, you don't have to go over the whole thing, but what is the steps to get where we need to get?
Do you have a synopsis for us?
Mr. Chair, Council Vice President Jenkins, I'm Mark Ruff. I'm the Chief Financial Officer. And certainly the clerk's office can weigh in as well, but this is the charter provision process is in this case not a process where we're moving toward a referendum. I think the idea is that we go to the Charter Commission, it comes back to this particular committee and the City Council as a whole. And at the time when the City Council as a whole approves this, it would be required that it be a 13-0 vote, so unanimous decision on the part of the City Council. If some of the members who were here in the last council term, we undertook a even more technical change to the bond sale process, and that did pass under the same provision. More specifically, the Charter Commission which will weigh in on this process, is scheduled to vote on this item June 6th at 4 o'clock, if anyone's interested in attending that particular meeting. It will be in front of the City Council then on June 15th, back to IGR on June 27th, and again, the 13-0 vote, assuming everybody can be there, is scheduled for Friday, June 20th. And then there is a reverse referendum process that's implicit with or involved with any charter provision. So this would not take effect until the reverse referendum process and the cooling off period, which would roughly be the end of September or beginning of October. So if that's the overview we're looking for. But again, the date that the council actually approves it does not have to be on the 29th. So if there's a time where there's somebody absent, we can always move that vote to another time.
Great. Thank you. Councilmember Orsami.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll love to move this item forward.
Thank you. Is there any further discussion, comments on this item? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, the motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Ruff, for your information on that as well. All right, now I think we move on to what everyone has eagerly been waiting for. Our team has been extremely busy over at the Capitol, and the legislative session finally wrapped up, and so we're very eager for this recap. And even before we begin that, just thank you so much to the whole team for all your hard work over there. You know, you put in long hours, nights, weekends, forgoing sleep, and probably food at normal, regular intervals as well. And it's a high stress environment, and we just greatly appreciate it. So welcome.
Thank you, Chair Johnson and committee members. My name is Sasha Bergman with the Intergovernmental Relations Department. Certainly, we're finally getting caught up, I think, on our sleep and having regular meals and not eating goldfish crackers for dinner and things like that. So pleased to be here today. What we wanted to update you on this afternoon is kind of just providing legislative updates, of course, on all the city's priorities, talk about some of the current outstanding issues that we expect to be resolved in the next couple of weeks as it relates to whether the governor would veto or sign various bills that are coming up. And then looking ahead to the 2019 session, I know we just wrapped up the 2018 session, but already there are some issues that we anticipate will be coming up next session based on action this past last few months. So going into the 2018 legislative session, which just wrapped up on Sunday night at midnight, or just before midnight, we knew that there were a few issues that would be on the table in an even-numbered year at the legislature. First, tax conformity. As you all know, the federal government passed tax reform in December, and since the Minnesota income tax system is closely linked to the federal government, or was, we knew that there would probably be a lot of discussion about how the state would choose to conform to some of those federal changes. Even numbered years are often bonding years, even though sometimes in an odd numbered year, bonding bill passes that year too. But we knew that bonding would be something that the legislature would probably be discussing. And then because odd numbered years are when the legislature does the budgeting for the next 2 fiscal years, in even numbered years, sometimes there's action as it relates to a supplemental budget, depending on how the state of the state's fiscal environment. And then finally, other issues, policy issues that had been cropping up related to opioids, elder abuse, and then the state's licensing and registration system, which had some technology issues. So that's kind of what we were anticipating would be discussed this session. So starting with local government finance, as it relates to federal tax conformity, and I won't get into the details of kind of what the House and the Senate and the governor had proposed related to federal tax conformity, but I'll just say that last week, or was it last week? Yeah, the legislature passed and the governor vetoed a first omnibus tax bill. That's House File 4385. And then just today, we learned that he vetoed the second omnibus tax bill, which was House File 947. It was very similar to the first one. There were, I think, 6 changes that were made in the second version of it. One of those changes being adding funding for school safety issues. But that is a bill that the governor just vetoed today. Some of the proposals that we were closely tracking related to local government aid this session did not move forward. Ultimately, in the bill, there were a couple of minor adjustments for the city of Lilydale and the city of Hermantown. But other big changes that were proposed were not included in either of the tax bills that were vetoed. So some of those proposals that came up this session were increasing local government aid and the funding for the formula, limiting or eliminating local government aid if a city is determined to be a sanctuary city, as the bill defines sanctuary cities. And then another proposal not listed here was, I believe, cutting local government aid to cities that provide, or in counties, I guess it would be county program aid as well for counties, to any local government that has expenditures related to the defense of undocumented immigrants. And then finally, changing the local government aid formula by adding a factor related to local sales tax revenue and kind of including that in the formula. And so none of those changes that I just mentioned were put into either of the bills that were vetoed. Some of the Minneapolis specific provisions that we were tracking in the local government finance area include the lodging tax cap repeal that we had on our legislative agenda. The bill was heard in the Senate and in the House. The Senate ended up including an increase in our cap from 13% to 13.875% instead of repealing the cap, and that would have restored us to the full 3% lodging tax, allowing us to capture that full amount that's authorized in law. But ultimately, that provision was not included in the first tax bill that was vetoed. However, it was one of the 6 changes that were made for the second tax bill. So it did get in the second tax bill, but again, that was just vetoed by the governor this morning. Also, a Minneapolis-specific provision related to tax increment financing for the Upper Harbor Terminal. These provisions were heard in the House, but the Senate did not hear any TIF bills this session. And so ultimately, that was not included in either of the tax bills, but it is something that the governor noted in his veto letter today about provisions that he supported that weren't included in the tax bill, and this was on that list. And then finally, related to the city's library debt service aid, no change ultimately passed into law, but the House, as it has proposed in the past, did propose repealing that library aid, and that was included in their final omnibus tax bill, but it was never included in either of the 2 tax bills that were sent to the governor. Unless there are questions about some of the LGA or tax items, I'll turn it over to Mr. Ranieri to talk about pensions.
Welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and committee members, I'm Gene Ranieri. I'm Director of Government Relations for the city. For the last 3 years, there have been attempts to try and pass a omnibus pension bill that would address some of the issues in our pension program to make them more fiscally solid and make sure they sustain and take care of pensioners into the future. The last couple of years, the pension bill has been tied to other bills that have been vetoed by the governor. This year, the bill traveled by itself. It was a standalone bill all the way through the House and through the Senate. The bill passed the Senate about 6 weeks ago. It passed the Senate 6 weeks ago, and at about 11:45 Sunday night, it passed the House 131 to nothing. What the bill would do, it would, for one thing, reduce the estimated rate of return from 7.5% to 7%. So that would increase, there would be a cost there to all of the pension members, including the employers. There would also be some changes to the design in the PERA general fund, where there would be, the COLA would no longer be automatic or triggered based on certain kinds of investments, earnings. It would be triggered based on what's happening to Social Security. If there's going to be a Social Security increase, there would be a COLA that would be 1/2 of that amount with no greater than being 3%. Also, the PERA Police and Fire Fund, there are some changes there that will impact our 2019 budget. Among them are, number one, the employer would have a contribution increase of 0.75% of payroll in 2019 and an additional 0.75% in 2020. And I know when Mr. Ruff presents the budget and Mayor presents the budget, that will be in our budget. Also in there is an increase to help with the police and fire, $4.5 million in general fund appropriations to go to PERA to help to keep that fund stable. They have a fairly good number of ratio, but this would help them become more stable. Other things in the pension bill address teachers, MSRS, the corrections fund. The whole total was the whole goal was to try and make sure that we had some fiscal stability and the ability to be sustainable. And everyone thinks we got there. And so I'll turn it over to, I have capital investment. Miss Lesh is not here today. She is homesick and she sends her regrets. So I'm filling in. I hope I do okay. The capital investment, as Ms. Bergman said earlier, in the even year, it traditionally is a bonding bill. And bonding bills usually run about $1 billion in general obligation bonds, and other things usually add them up to about 1.4 million. This bonding bill is proposed to be $800 million in general obligation and $25 million in addition to that general obligation for school safety or school security. So much smaller bonding bill. What the bill did, the first bill, it passed the House. The Senate bill failed in the Senate. On Sunday, and I don't remember the exact times, a bonding bill did pass in the House. It went to the Senate. There were some amendments in the Senate. What it did do is it's waiting action out to the governor. And the bill includes some things that are really different that we've seen before, not seen before. One is that this bill includes funding from the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, from the Environment Fund, to fund projects that have an environmental nature. But we've never seen that before, and they're issuing bonds based on those revenues. So that is a new precedent, new thing, and we're not sure if it's going to be a precedent or not. And it could cause some discussions not only at the Capitol, but in other quarters in the next couple of weeks. We had several projects that we proposed. One was the Upper Harbor Terminal. Oh, I'm sorry. One was the Upper Harbor Terminal for $15 million. That's included in the bill. There's also $10 million for the Family Partnership. They were in the bill last year for, I think, 1.6 for planning and design, and this year they have $10 million for them this year. Other things that are not in the bill that we proposed, or other inclusions, the Stone Arch Bridge for $1 million. As you're aware, that is owned by the state of Minnesota. It is an iconic project throughout, iconic building structure throughout our state. Anytime there's a big national event here in Minneapolis or in the Twin Cities, it's the Spoon and Cherry and the Stone Arch Bridge that usually make the national media. That needs some work. And MnDOT's estimating that's a $13 million project. The $1 million will allow them to start the planning, design, and engineering, and they'll have to come back and receive, hopefully, funds next year and the year after. There's also funds for the American Indian Center, $5 million. That's for, I think, reconstruction and rehabilitation of the center. $1 million to the Children's Museum, the Children's Theater, and that's Hennepin County will be the fiscal agent there. There's $10 million for regional parks. We were hoping for 15, but we came up short. And also there was metropolitan inflow and infiltration grants, $5 million, and that's a continuation of about a 3 or 4 year process. What wasn't in some of our priority projects were the stormwater tunnel. I know some of you may have taken the tour. I know legislators took the tour, going down and look at those tunnels. However, we did not get an appropriation for that, but we think we might be able to get into some of the grant programs and loan programs of the Public Facilities Authority, and we will do some more work on that. We did not receive any funds for the Upper St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam. That was a request of 1.5, nor for the Emergency Operations and Training Facility. I think one big disappointment for the session, they're in the bonding bill and in the transportation bill. Transportation is defined to be roads and bridges and not transit. Our delegation in the Senate was so concerned about this and upset about this, no one on our delegation voted for the bonding bill Sunday night in the Senate because of the transportation issue. Senator Dibble spoke for transit and tried to get additional funds for transit. We did not. We will start an effort soon with our folks who work at the Met Council and the Council to see what we can do to find ways to get the D line and all those arterial projects off the ground and running. So that was one of the biggest disappointments, I think, in the bonding bill this session. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will stop, answer any questions you may have, and turn it over to Ms. Nelson.
Questions? Not seeing any.
And Mr. Chairman, Jennifer Nelson was our intern. And traditionally, every year we ask our intern to make a presentation at the session right after the legislative session.
Excellent, Mr. Ranieri. It looks like I do have either a comment or question from Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, and I really want to hear the report from the intern, but I do just want to, share my disappointment in the lack of transit funding in the omnibus bill, but I know we cannot abandon this battle, and I'm just wondering, what are some of your thoughts for next steps? How do we move forward to really ensure that we can make these important transit improvements in our city, but also for the region? And so, maybe what are some of your thoughts, or I don't know if some of your other staff members may have some thoughts.
Mr. Chairman, Council Vice President Jenkins, we have been talking about this already. We think that there was a good first step when the Metro Council got all of the communities along the line together. I think we need to think about that again and try and throughout the summer, not only think about how we get maybe state funding, but there are other sources and how we can work together on this project. Because it is not just, as you say, a city project. It is a regional project. It goes all the way from Brooklyn Center down through our city in Richfield to Bloomington. So all four of us and everyone in the western end of the metro region have to be involved. And I think Ms. Olson, who's been thinking about this too, has some comments.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair and Vice President Jenkins, actually, Jean pretty much said what we've been discussing so far. As you know, there has been a group convened, the D-Line Coalition, including partners from Richfield, Bloomington, Brooklyn Center, City Minneapolis, and across different jurisdictions, and also the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce has been a key partner in this as well. So I think it's time to reconnect with all those partners who have talked about how important this project is, and to think about next session, but also think about if this is the landscape that we're dealing with, and if we don't expect that to change, how are we going to go from here and really start looking at the full range of alternative ways to support really excellent projects that we all stand behind? So I think we have to reconnect with that group of partners.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, Councilmember Schrader.
Oh, just quickly, I just want to second what Council Vice President Jenkins was saying about just needing to be proactive on the D-line. Just thank you for already thinking ahead to what things we have to work on. This isn't a new fight at the Capitol. I think it's extremely short-sighted. This specifically, the D-line and some of these transportation projects should not be partisan, and they have unfortunately been that way. So I look forward to working with you all and hopefully getting these moving.
Great. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair and Council members. My name is Jennifer Nelson. I was the legislative aide for the 2018 session with IGR, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened with transportation and the Met Council. So the big priority that we have in transportation was the driver's license suspension reform. It was a project we did a lot of work on this year, and it was a bill to look at eliminating suspensions that are happening solely because of unpaid traffic tickets or failure to appear in court after said traffic tickets. And that bill actually was very well received by partisan support. Lead authors in both chambers were Republican members. It was moving as a standalone bill in the House, but ultimately got combined into the supplemental budget omnibus bill. And it eliminated those suspensions and also made licenses currently suspended for those reasons eligible for reinstatement. However, unfortunately, it wasn't that giant package that was vetoed this morning. So that's something that didn't quite make it, getting lumped in with everything else. Another big transportation issue that came up at the Capitol was the proposed constitutional amendment for transportation funding. And this was an amendment that was proposed that would have placed a question on the November ballot that would ask voters whether or not they wanted to take the revenues from sales of auto parts and repair to go towards funding for roads and bridges. It would have created a special revenue fund for those items. And it was very interesting the way it played out at the Capitol. It became quite contentious, particularly between private and public sector unions, because it did not create a new revenue funding stream. It merely would reallocate funds that right now go into the general fund into this special account. So other areas such as education that are also funded from the general fund didn't like the diversion of money, whereas people doing contracting or construction were in favor of making those jobs. It moved in the House, and they did ultimately pass it off the House floor, but it was not taken up in the Senate. So it will not be on the ballot. It ended up stalling out there. And then the one item we wanted to highlight with the Met Council is this Senate File 2809, which deals with restructuring the governance of the Met Council, which is something that's been tried before over the years and generally hasn't made it past governors. What it would do, it would change the Met Council rather than its current governance structure where the members are appointed by the governor. It would increase that membership up to 29 members, mostly made up of local elected officials. So what they would do is they would give membership to county boards would appoint members. Hennepin County would get 2 members. Each other county would get 1. And of those 2 Hennepin County members, 1 would represent a board that includes Minneapolis and 1 outside of Minneapolis. And then they would have, it would be a local elected official appointed from each council district. And those would be decided by a newly formed municipal committee that would exist in each district. And then the Commissioner of Transportation or their designee, and then the commissioner would get to appoint 1 person each in the areas of public transit, non-motorized transportation, and freight transportation. And one thing that was added to this membership in conference committee is to give some power back to the governor was that it would allow they amended it to allow the governor to appoint the chair. So it would shift to mostly locally elected officials as the membership, but the governor would still get to choose who the chair of the council would be. It would also shift the terms to 4-year staggered terms, and it would eliminate the Transportation Advisory Board. But in conference committee, when they were discussing that elimination, they did recognize that there is still a need for technical expertise in the area of transportation. So they did adopt language that would instead that would establish a technical advisory committee, which previously existed under that board, of professional staff from local governments and agencies that could help inform them on the projects that they were working on. This was passed by both bodies, and it's still waiting action by the governor. So he has 14 days passed to decide what to do on it, and he has not yet done anything with this bill. So we're still waiting to see whether it becomes law or not. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Ranieri.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to cover public safety, gun violence. In the public safety issue, there was a bill, as you're aware, that increased penalties, enhanced penalties for people who were obstructing freeways and public infrastructure. The governor did veto that bill on Saturday, but then it was included into the supplemental bill, but then it was taken out in conference committee. So that bill didn't move this year. On gun violence, one of the focuses was on school safety and the move to put $25 million into schools. It was also involved in, there were several attempts by legislators, particularly from Minneapolis, St. Paul, DFL members, to try and do something along the lines of either the red flag warning legislation or background checks. There were attempts on the floor to amend that on the legislation, and in several places it was considered to be not germane to the bill being debated. At this time, nothing happened on gun violence this year, and I think something we need to work again on next year.
Mr. Chair and committee members, in the area of affordable housing, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that were included in the supplemental budget bill, which Ms. Nelson mentioned was vetoed today. There was a provision that would repeal the exception in the rent control prohibition statute that allows for voters to vote on an ordinance if the local unit of government has the authority to have such an ordinance. And there were a few provisions that were included in the supplemental budget bill that were removed in committee before it was advanced to the governor. One of those things was requiring the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency to have a report on local regulations, permits, fees, and any impacts that those have on affordable housing. There's been a lot of discussion on that issue in the governor's housing task force. And so I expect that there will be continued discussion about local government regulations and fees and permits and how that relates to affordable housing production. But that was not ultimately included in the bill that was sent to the governor for veto. There was some tax-exempt bond reform that was included in the supplemental budget bill. It's quite a complex area of law, but essentially there was a steering committee that met over the interim to work on some reforms to the tax-exempt bonding statute. And as you know, we are an entitlement jurisdiction for tax-exempt bonds that from the federal government. The 5 consensus items that came out of that steering committee were included in the supplemental budget bill, along with some items that were not consensus items, but ultimately that got vetoed. However, there are some changes to tax-exempt bond reform that relate to the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency that were included in the bonding bill that passed, and I think the impact of that on the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency is at this point unknown, but we are closely tracking that as we, do work in this area too, as a city. And then there was no new funding included in the Housing Finance Agency or for the Housing Finance Agency in the supplemental budget bill. In the bonding bill, there was $50 million for housing infrastructure bonds included. There was $30 million for housing infrastructure bonds for permanent supportive housing for individuals with behavioral health needs. So more investment in housing infrastructure bonds, but with some requirements tied to it on what it's used for. And then $10 million for public housing rehabilitation. Another thing that the Homes for All Coalition has included as one of the updates from the bonding bill, but I think there's some question about exactly how much of this funding goes to build new housing, is $30 million for mental health crisis centers. So that was also included in the bonding bill. So when you pair all of those investments together, that's quite a sizable investment for housing. And so the Homes for All Coalition is very excited about these investments. Finally, I'll note that the bonding bill does allow for 2 new uses for housing infrastructure bonds, so expanding it to include senior housing and then manufactured home parks. The bonding bill is now on the governor's desk, but we don't yet know what his action will be. He could line item veto some items that are in that bill, some of the money items, not the policy.
Okay, thank you. We have a question or a comment from Councilmember Schrader.
Yeah, no, I actually want to take it back to I had a question about the supplemental budget. You mentioned some specific provisions that around the tax-exempt bonds that were that went through for MHFA. Could you go into a little more detail on that?
Yes, I'll do that to the best of my ability. So there were 5 consensus items that were included. I don't have those off the top of my head in terms of just reform to the statute, but it was, a steering committee came together. Andrea Brennan from the housing division of CPED participated on behalf of the city. And so they, a lot of folks were supportive of these 5 consensus modifications to the tax-exempt bond process. The 2 provisions that were not consensus items, one related to the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency's qualified allocation plan, so related to their 4% tax credits. And so, there are certain requirements that the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency has for the allocation of the 4% tax credits, maybe length of affordability required or cost containment issues. And so those provisions would remove, I think, some of the ability of the Department of the Housing Finance Agency to impose certain cost requirements and would allow for a developer to challenge the requirements. That was removed from the supplemental budget, but then that was included in the bonding bill that passed. And then there was another, I think, 2 years taking away the set aside for home ownership in Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, but ultimately that was in the vetoed bill.
Okay.
Does that help?
That is. Thank you very much for that. And just as a point of background, is this kind of stemming from the Havitt bill from last session?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, Mr. Chair, council member. So there was an effort last session to modify the tax-exempt bond statute. Ultimately, it didn't become law, but I think all the stakeholders were sort of directed to come together around some agreed upon changes. So the steering committee was formed to create, a set of agreements that could move forward. But there was still some desire, I think, from some folks to push other items forward that were not part of those 5 agreed upon consensus items. So
No, great, thanks.
thank you. Okay, a couple of provisions related to public health that were included in the supplemental budget bill that was vetoed today. One provision would have redirected funding currently allocated for the Good Food Access Program, urban agriculture, and farm to school. I think that funding was taken away from those areas and allocated instead to mental health for farmers. Ultimately, that did not become law, but I think the reasoning there was the Ag Committee had a zero target, so they couldn't spend any money without sort of taking it from somewhere else. They weren't given an additional amount of money that they were allowed to spend. So that had been proposed. Also, earmarking some of the statewide health improvement partnership funding for tobacco cessation. Our health department receives funding from the statewide health improvement partnership, and that's usually used for prevention, so maybe tobacco prevention or other preventative health measures. Ultimately, of course, that's not included or not going to become law. And then finally, expanding the use of evidence-based home visiting for culturally or ethnically targeted home visiting programs was also a provision related to public health in the bill. In the area of local control, as I think many of you know, we have been working closely with the League of Minnesota Cities and Metro Cities on a whole host of bills that have been introduced over the last biennium to preempt local authority or kind of tie the hands of local units of government in a wide range of issue areas. Combined with the bills that were introduced last session, so I think there were more than 30 introduced last session. Now there's a total of more than 50, I think maybe like 55 or 60 bills that have been introduced, and many of them have been, moving through the process to some extent or been given hearings or included in omnibus bills. A couple of these just of note. Mr. Chair, as you know from testifying, the prohibition on auxiliary containers and allowing local governments to regulate those, that was heard in the House and Senate, but it was ultimately not included in a final budget bill or final bill that moved across the finish line. There was a prohibition on ranked choice voting that also did not ultimately move forward, but was given hearings. And then preemption of transportation network company regulations, which is something that was given a number of hearings, and Mr. Ranieri would know the details about all of the different negotiations that began on that issue. Ultimately, that did not move forward, but we anticipate that'll be something probably that will be dealt with or discussed next session. And then finally, the preemption of local employment regulations, which was tied to the bonding bill or the pension bill last year, and is why that bill was vetoed. Ultimately, did not move forward. We didn't see it in any bills, and I think it was provided as an amendment on the floor, an amendment to an amendment, but the initial amendment was withdrawn, so it was really not discussed this legislative session. And unless you have any questions, I will turn it back over to Mr. Ranieri.
That sounds good. Thank you. Oh, Councilmember Schrader? No. All right.
Mr. Chairman, one thing to add in the area of the local control, also in the tax bill, there was an amendment that basically said we can't add any taxes, which we can't do now, but also taxes on food, retail, and bags. That amendment was amended to say you could do a fee for regulation and administration. That provision is in the tax bill and it was vetoed, so that didn't go forward either. In the area of opioids, I know the city will be having a task force working on this. There's a lot of, all over this country, there's been an issue on the abuse of opioids. There was a bill in the Senate authored by Senator Rosen, the chair of the committee, chair of the Finance Committee, that basically would have implemented a couple things. One, if pharmacies would be, doctors and people who are prescribing opioids would be asked or directed to have limits on how many can be subscribed at one time. So, and there were in the bill, there were a listing of how many at so many times. There also was a registration trying to find out if the person who was in it asking for painkillers is getting from someplace else. There is a pilot program up in Little Falls where the St. Gabriel's Hospital Clinic has been fairly successful in working with folks to get them off opioids, get them into treatment, and to work very closely with the public safety folks, the county social services, treatment centers, and then just basically working with the client themselves. This clinic includes not only doctors, but also social workers and job employment folks. And they've received some funding again this year to branch out throughout central Minnesota. What Senator Rosen's bill did, and most importantly, was to say that the pharmacies or the pharmaceutical companies would be contributing to the program. They would be charged at one time a penny a pill, and it would go up to about $20 million that she was trying to raise. It was changed then to be a registration fee to be paid by the pharmaceutical companies and the pharmaceutical distributors to, again, go up to about $20 million. That funding mechanism was not accepted, is not in the bill. Over in the House, they decided to go all general fund. The final bill in the supplemental budget included about $5.6 million this year and a total of $16 million over 3 years for this whole issue of opioids. And that bill, like the entire bill, has been vetoed. So there's basically nothing in statute new right today or additional funding for opioid abuse and prevention. Another major issue, and something that's periphery to us, but there are an awful lot of nursing homes and home care and assisted living centers in our city. And as you're aware, I think back in November of 2017, the Star Tribune did a story about abuse in those facilities occurring throughout the state. Task forces were established. The governor had a task force. The legislature had a task force. A bill did come. The bill was designed to do a couple things. One, it allowed people, based on some criteria, to actually have a monitoring camera in their rooms, so maybe their children could watch what was going on. And there were some guarantees on privacy for a roommate. There also was a lot of requirements for explanation who owned the facilities and who to contact when there was a problem. Also, there was more procedures for the Department of Health and the Department of Human Services, but more for the Department of Health to investigate and report on these kinds of issues. There were 2 task forces established, one to come back with some additional regulations, and another one was to come back on crimes and what kinds of crimes and penalties there should be and how to work with law enforcement on this whole area of elder abuse. Unfortunately, this was in the big bill, the omnibus bill, and it did not pass. And it was vetoed today by the governor. On the energy issue, this is a very interesting issue. It was something that the Xcel Energy had a bill that basically gave them sort of a streamlined process to get approval to do improvements to their 3 nuclear plants, which they were going to be deeming as carbon-free facilities. They were asking for, the numbers vary, but I think the last number I heard was $1.4 billion in improvements to the 3 facilities, 2 at Prairie Island and 1 at Monticello. They would be a rather quick process. They would basically get their approval first and then move forward. And if there were any sort of overrides or cost overruns, at one time it seemed to be falling back on the ratepayers, and another time was falling back on maybe the ratepayers and the stockholders, but I think it really fell back on the ratepayers. That bill was reviewed and probably amended 3 or 4 different times. It was separated from the omnibus bill and traveled by itself. It did not pass the House, nor did it, but I think it did pass the Senate. It was to be debated on the floor on Sunday night. It never was brought up. There was another thing that was another issue to energy, this time on solar energy, that somehow appeared in the omnibus bill. What it basically did was took the word financing out of some of the PUC reviews when it came to approving solar projects. There was a concern in the solar community and among our energy folks that killed solar. The governor flagged that. He had a list of about 100 items he wanted taken out of the bill. And that was one of them. It was not taken out of the bill, but the bill was vetoed today. Other topics that were prominent this session, the elections. There was $1.5 million appropriated in the big bill for voter registration, and it could receive some state funding, federal funding, but again, that was vetoed. The next bill is the omnibus liquor bill. That is a bill that every year includes provisions dealing with how we distribute and sell alcoholic beverages, how we brew and have the craft brewers, the winemakers. It's become a rather large area of a statute now. It used to be just basically beer and alcohol. Now it's winemaking, cider making, all of different kinds of stores. There's exclusive stores that sell items, but they don't sell the product. They sell the things to make the product. That's all regulated in Chapter 340A. Also usually included in those Chapter 340A amendments are special liquor licenses for municipalities and counties. We have 3 of the 5 in our city. 2 of them, I think, are on Penn Avenue, and 1 is on Nicollet. You, as a city council, will be being requested to give local approval to those bills, and then would go to our folks in CPED to go through the licensing process. So approving the legislation doesn't mean you're approving the license; it's just approving the authority to do that. That will be coming up soon. There are some questions being raised by legislators saying, look, we're not going to oppose these. Why should we be doing these? Is there a better way to do it? Senator Latz had a bill that basically said, notwithstanding any city charter or county charter to the contrary, you do it. And I know we'll be talking to the city attorney. We've been talking already about what's the process if we wanted to change our charter to address this whole liquor issue. Because I'm hearing legislators saying, why are we doing this?
Yeah, and I'll also note that I heard recently from the Southwest Business Association that they are interested in looking at that as well. So there might be some external partners in an effort like that.
This is Mr. Chairman, this is a rather fascinating area. There's the regulatory scheme in Chapter 340A is pretty strict. It tells you how many times you can have an event for a nonprofit on a certain location. You can only do so many of those temporary licenses. It's just, and then of course for the longest time we had liquor hours. Now they're a little bit longer, but it's a rather fascinating, and the folks who work in it, it's a fascinating field. In the area of, this was basically for tipped employees. There was an attempt to return to the 2-tier system where there would be a lower minimum wage and then tips would be paid back, divided up. That was in the Jobs Omnibus bill, and it did not make it across the finish line. So that did not occur this session. And then MNLARS, that's the Minnesota dealing with license plates and all the registrations of vehicles. There was funding proposed, and also some funding not only for the department to finish the system, but also for some of the deputy registrars who have lost money. It's my understanding that neither one of those passed this session.
Mr. Chair, we'll wrap up by just talking about a couple of outstanding issues. As I think we mentioned in this presentation, the governor has 14 days to take action on remaining bills. As we've mentioned, he's vetoed the tax bill and the supplemental budget bill, but there are still some bills we're watching, Met Council governance, pensions, bonding, and liquor bill to see whether he signs those into law. And I guess I would note that I think in the governor's press conference today when he was talking about the tax bill and the supplemental budget bill that he vetoed, that he does not plan to call a special session to deal with any of those issues that were vetoed. So I think there's been some that have floated the idea of having a special session later on this year to address federal conformity going into next year. But right now his intention is not to have a special session. And then just looking ahead to 2019, of course, in November, the gubernatorial election will be taking place, as well as all 134 House members. So that could change, well, for sure will change some things, of course, with some retirements in the House. But depending on the outcomes of that, it could change the makeup, or excuse me, the power of the House and the legislature. And then potential issues that could come up next year, vetoed issues from this session, so opioids, elder abuse, tax conformity. Next year will be a budget year. They start early January, so budget will be on the top of everyone's minds. And then some provisions or some proposals related to sexual harassment. And I don't think that we talked about this in detail, but there were proposals to address the sexual harassment law and make it easier for victims to bring a case forward. But that ultimately did not pass into law, so we expect that to be revisited next session. One thing just to put on your radar, the provider tax, the 2% provider tax on health providers in the state, it expires at the end of, I think it's 2019. That funding goes to Minnesota Care, but also it pays for the statewide health improvement partnership, which I mentioned earlier, that the health department receives to do some preventative health work. So that will be probably something that's discussed. That's something that the governor proposed in his tax bill this year to continue and to not have it expire. Ultimately, that, of course, did not become law. So that might be something that's discussed next session. Maybe resolving the transportation network companies issue that came up this session. Then, of course, we anticipate gun violence prevention will continue to be a topic that folks are thinking about. So with that, I will conclude, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that presentation. Do we have any questions or comments from committee members? Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. And this is not necessarily a question, more of a comment, but 2 of the special license requests are in Ward 8, and I certainly have spoken to. They're surrounded by a number of other businesses that don't have access to that, and so it's going to create a really significant imbalance in that particular area. But I think it's a challenge across the entire city, and I really believe it's an issue that we as a council need to really think about addressing. And so I'm happy that you've started the conversation, Mr. Ranieri, particularly with our city attorney's office, and really hope to work with you all to figure out how we can come to some good policy issues around this concern. So thank you.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments from committee members? Mr. Ranieri, do you have a comment? Okay. Any additional questions or comments? Well, again, you have our sincere thanks for all your hard work over this session and ongoing work, and provided the bonding bill gets signed. I mean, I think it's, aside from not getting funding for the D-line, I think it's to have our #1 priority fully funded through the bonding bill, to have a number of additional items funded, to not see any preemption bills get through. It feels like to me a pretty successful session overall for the city, even though it's certainly not perfect. Certainly there are other opportunities as well, and there are other things that we definitely wanted to see get done, but we're glad that it wasn't coming up short, or coming up completely empty. So, Mr. Ranieri, any comments on that?
Mr. Chairman, just concluding comment. We will have a written, more detailed written document within the next week or two, probably more like 2.5 weeks on what happened in the session, and then looking forward to next. And also, we want to thank you and the committee and all members of the council. We asked to come over several times and make phone calls and emails, and we really appreciate that. And we appreciate some of our members, like Councilmember Schrader came over for a couple hours and walked around, and so did Councilmember Johnson. You were there several times testifying. We would appreciate that, and the council president was there. And we will call upon you all the time to come over. I also want to thank my staff and all the city staff, because it's really a collective effort of not only folks you see here and Ms. Blesh, but people throughout the city who work for the city, who we constantly rely on for information, and we really like to thank them too.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, we will move to receive and file this presentation. Any discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. Having no further business, this meeting's adjourned.